we will glorify the Lord. I appreciate your singing that song and edifying me, and I hope that we are edified. If you're here this morning, and I'm sure glad you are, but if you're here this morning and you're not in a position to glorify God, I hope that you'll think seriously about making a change. It's a whole lot better to serve God than to live in fear of Him or to try to ignore Him. And I'm grateful that we can be together and to rejoice together in that blessing. And if you're here this morning as a child of God and you didn't sing that song, or for whatever reason, I hope you'll think about why. It's a privilege to be able to worship God, and I hope and pray that it's one that we do always take from the heart. Let me mention something before I begin the lesson this morning. This is the first Sunday, and we do have classes this afternoon, and then singing tonight. This afternoon at, let me get this right, I think it's 3:45, isn't it? 3:45, we plan to come together. The ladies will have a class, and the men will be continuing their study of the subject of leadership. And we do plan to look at lesson 11 tonight. So if that really will concentrate a lot on John, the 10th chapter. If you do not have a book and would like one, let me know, and I will work to get you one. If you need a copy just to get by the lesson today, let me know again, and I'll make sure that you get one. I appreciate so much those who make that a priority, who take time with that class. The men's class, our purpose there is to try to help us to be better leaders. We need leaders in a local church, and we need to let God teach us what a leader is. So that'll be our purpose this afternoon, and I'd be happy for you to be there and be a part of that. The ladies' class as well, edifying, and I appreciate those who do take part and lead and share that work as well. I want to just begin this morning by asking you to think back to a period in Israel's history. We talk about the United Kingdom. For a long time, God ruled Israel through Moses and through Joshua. And then there was a period after Joshua when judges ruled and God was their king, but they didn't like that. They wanted a king to be like the nations about them. So we went through Saul and David and Solomon. One of the things we remember about Solomon was that Solomon was a unique man, fabulously wise and fabulously wealthy. And his wealth was hard to miss in those days. There's a reference, just one example, in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 16 and 17. If you had gone to this great palace house, the house of the forest of Lebanon, you would have seen a lot of things that would have made your mouth drop. But one of them, I think, involved some golden shields. The text says, King Solomon made 200 large shields of hammered gold, using 15 pounds of gold on each shield. He also made 300 small shields of hammered gold, using 4 pounds of gold on each shield. And the king put them in the hall, which he called the Forest of Lebanon. I got to looking and thinking about these shields, decorative pieces, and the amount of gold that was in each of these shields. You take 200 shields, 15 pounds apiece, and another 300 shields using, 4 pounds apiece there? And then you try to add all that up, and then you try to divide that into ounces, and it comes out to 67,000 ounces of gold. And then you start thinking about, well, I don't know exactly if their ounce is equivalent to the ounces, the troy ounce by which people measure gold today, and the price of gold does fluctuate. I'm not in the gold market, so I have to look that thing up once in a while, but I think it's around $2,000 an ounce. And so, just in material terms, these shields of gold that would have lined the hall of this great forest of Lebanon house, called so because of the great cedar beams that were used to build it, that the price in modern terms of this decoration would have been in the neighborhood of $130 million. More than that, like north of that actually. I can't count that high. And I think about how impressive this would have been to look at. And I think also about this. What happened to those shields? Well, we know the answer to that question. And if you keep reading in 1 Kings, and you come to 1 Kings chapter 14, and I invite you to turn there, we'll find out what happened to these shields. Solomon was wealthy and in some ways wise, but he was not faithful to God for a good part of his life, later life. And God's anger spilled out, and he cursed Solomon in that he told him that though the house of David would continue, he was going to take most of the kingdom away from his family and give it to somebody else. And so that's what happened in the days of his son. Now, Solomon's son was a guy named Rehoboam. And if we turn over to 1 Kings chapter 14 and verse 25, let me see if verse 25. It came to pass in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away all. And he took away, notice, all the shields of gold which Solomon had made. Now, verse 27 says that Rehoboam made in their stead brazen shields and committed them into the hands of the chief of the guard which kept the door of the king's house. And it was so when the king went into the house of the Lord that the guard bare them and brought them back into the guard chamber. We've been studying recently about this period of history, and I'm sure through the years that you've remembered this story about Rehoboam's brazen shields, his bronze shields. The golden shields were lost due to sin, and Rehoboam decided to substitute them. He didn't go back to gold, but he went to bronze instead. I thought about Rehoboam and how many times he must have walked by those golden shields as a young man growing up in Solomon's house, and having seen these magnificent shields, and they would have been magnificent to look at. And when they were lost, then he's made a rather poor substitution and put those bronze shields up, which were not worthless, but they were certainly nothing in comparison. They corrupted. They had to be cleaned, had to be worked with. They were a poor substitute for the real thing. And I'm not the first fellow to make this comparison, but I think there's sort of a metaphor there about the way people live their lives. You know, God has gold for us, but men, because of sin, wind up losing what God has provided and given to us and wants to bless us with, and instead try to substitute other things that to them look similar, but actually are nothing in comparison. I've thought about how that just in the very nature of religion, that men today try to make substitutions, and they substitute the bronze shields for the real thing. You know, we live in an age in which in our society, the worship of and the knowledge of the true God is less and less valued. And what is put in its place so many times is just this man-made religion. Paganism is a good broad term for it. We think paganism is of a time gone by. Look around you. What do you see today in Western society, in the United States, in Alabama? You see people who turn for answers and look for something to bring meaning to their life in the occult, in those who are fortune tellers, in the New Age mysticism, a belief in the universe being somehow able to help us, if it'll direct us, the universe has our back. That's the name, by the way, of a book that was a New York Times bestseller. And I think about how can people who have a driver's license and seem to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, how can they be deceived by these silly old superstitions? Well, it's actually a problem that men have had through the years. The rise in the interest in spiritualism and the occult and seances and all these kinds of things, looking for answers from all the wrong sources, really comes when people simply, because of their actions, cannot and will not get answers from God. I think about King Saul over in 1 Samuel 28. We'll not read that story, but if you remember that story, it's King Saul is at the end of his life. God has rejected him as king. He has rejected God first place. But here he is, desperate. The enemy is at the door, and the last great battle is at hand, and it's obvious that Saul will not survive it. And so he appeals to God, and God will not hear. And so Saul says, well, I'll just find answers somewhere else. It's a little bit funny. It's not really funny, but a little bit funny. If you know Saul's story, you know that Saul had worked to rid the land of Israel of all of these witches, as they were called. And those who were, there's nothing new about the occult and about people who claim to be able to speak to the dead and so on. And so Saul had threatened them with death and rid the land of them. But when King Saul said, I'm just going to ask for a medium, I'm going to need someone to speak to the dead for me. They had no problem finding out where they were. They're right down the road here. You can't get rid of them. They're sort of a little bit like insects that way. They're just hard to get rid of the ants. And so he has an encounter here. And what he finds is something very different from what he looked for. You can read that story or remember it. But the idea is that people who don't like the message of God, they'll find answers at other places. Saul was an example of that. He's not the last one to go that way. If you don't like God's message, then just seek another voice. Make up a voice. Create your own God to lead. That voice will always tell you what you want to hear. That's the problem. It's not really a voice, it's an echo, because we make up that God. That's what people do today. They make up their own God. Paul in Acts 17 was in the center of the intellectual world at that time, Athens, Greece. It's where all the smart and the wise and the learned and the great and the good communed. Having visited the city, he was given an opportunity to speak to the city leaders. And that's the record in Acts 17, verse 22. He stood in the midst of Mars Hill, the Areopagus in the native language. It's not just a location, it's also a council. It's a place where the council met on the Hill of Mars there in Athens. You can still see the spot. It's right down, if you've ever seen pictures, maybe you've been there, of the old Greece, old Athens, I should say, the Acropolis. Well, just below that great building is the area here known as the Areopagus or Mars Hill. And he said, you men of Athens, I perceive that in all things ye are too superstitious. The old King James says, maybe your translation says it, very religious. I passed by, I beheld your devotions, all of these religious devotions, all of these religious shrines. He said, I found one that said, to the unknown God, as if you said, well, hey, if we missed one, we'll just put a place for him. He said, you missed one, all right, you missed the one. And I want to tell you about him. And he tells them about the true God, the God that made the world and all things that are therein. He's Lord of heaven and earth. He doesn't dwell in temples made with hands, in the sense that you can't put him in a box, you can't contain him in a temple, you can't feed him, he doesn't need to be fed. He's the one that made all things. He made men. Why? So that they might seek after him and find him, though he be not far from every one of us. And what you need to do is repent and get in line with his will, because he made us and he will hold us into account. And so it's up to us to listen to his voice. You will never find what you're looking for until you do that. That's a message that needs to be preached in 21st century Alabama and America as much as it did back then. People substitute all kinds of notions and ideas and man-made gods and man-made religions for the true message. And we'll never find anything but disappointment. The God that we make up is a God too small to help us. The God that made all things is the one we need to find and hear and obey. That's a simple but true point. I'll take another substitute that's very common in our society. Promiscuity, as opposed to God's plan for the family. You listen to people today, people in education, people in government, and they will talk about the family, traditional family structure, as if it's just an idea that somebody came up with, and that, maybe we've just gone way past that now and we've got a better idea. Well, it is an old idea, that's for sure. It is, as we read the scriptures, it is God's idea for man. And if you go back to the book of Genesis, chapter 2, it was God that created marriage. A man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. The idea of two becoming one, a real commitment, a bond. As we continue to read, and as civil government became more of a factor, it was a government-sanctioned bond, a legal responsibility that we take on. If you continue reading in the law of Moses, in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, Exodus chapter 20, under the old law, the family, sometimes we talk about the nuclear family. That doesn't mean they're radioactive. There are a few of those too. But the idea of a family bound together in the traditional sense. That bond of family was a very formal and serious thing under the law. In Genesis chapter 20 and in verse 14, thou shalt not commit adultery. Two shall be one. And the idea of breaking that trust was punishable by death. We also continue to read in the same setting here in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. What was the commandment? Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long in the land. And so the idea of a family where you have a husband and a wife that are bound to one another, and you have children then that are brought up in that relationship under the obedience of their parents. And this picture of a family is an old picture. It's one that all of us recognize. It came from God. People today look at it a little bit like maybe some sort of exotic animal in a zoo. The nuclear family. This traditional family of a father and a mother and children, and then an extended family, oftentimes that came from that, and that is that you might have had grandparents or even aunts and uncles that lived in the same area, same space, sometimes the same house. But it was a family, and everybody recognized that to be so. And the advantages that come from that would take more time than we've got today, of accountability and love and training and mutual help one of another, the younger who need the help, and then the older who need the help as well. It's the family bond as God designed it. And then you have what some call the evolution of the family. It's a change, all right, but not in a good direction. Let's scrap all that. We don't need this idea of people being married. What's marriage but a piece of paper? You can be just as married. I read one time where a fellow, some celebrity of some type or another, he had been with this woman, had several children with her, and somebody asked him, "Why is it you've never married?" He said, "I'm the most married guy you know." And then a few years later, I read where they split up, and I thought, well, they weren't that married, apparently. Of course, people sometimes abuse marriage. I recognize that. But I'll tell you, when you have two people who use each other as husband and wife, but they are not willing to make that commitment, or at least not yet, why not? Something is missing there. And that something that's missing is important. It's a God-ordained commitment to one another. We're going to work through the problems. We are stuck together, and we wouldn't have it any other way. And in the dark times, the difficult times, the good times, we're going to make it through because we're committed to this. Don't get into it if you don't have that kind of commitment. And if you have that kind of commitment, it ought to be sealed with that promise and that oath. But today, we just live together and just see how that works out. That's not made people happy. People say, well, that's just love without strings attached. What planet do you live on where you think two people are going to use each other as husband and wife and one of them walk off and the other's not going to notice? And our society just seems to have sat up all night, week after week, trying to dream up ways to destroy people's lives. Easy divorce. I may have shared this with you before, forgive me if I have, but this has been about a year or two ago. I got a bill in the mail. It's not news, is it? But I got a bill in the mail from a hospital. I think it was. And had my wife's name on it, so I call up the folks and I say, well, hey, I'd just like to know it. There's no indication on the bill. What's this for? And they said, well, we can't tell you. And I said, well, why not? You want me to pay it, don't you? Why don't you go ahead and tell me? And they said, well, that's your wife's bill, and we can't talk to you about it. We just have to talk to your wife. In fact, we can't even talk to her over the phone. She'll have to give us written permission for you to talk to us or something. I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, you do realize that if I was a scoundrel, I could go down right now to the courthouse and get a divorce and my wife wouldn't even know it. But you can't talk to me about a bill. This is how fouled up this thing is. How little people respect the idea of marriage. Marriage is nothing. The government encourages people to not get married. Encourages people to have children out of wedlock, which is a very destructive thing for everybody in the picture, and especially for the children. To have all these families that have all of this confusion to them, how can this be good? But men have decided we've got a better way than God, so we get the bronze shields out, and they just don't match up. What God has told us long ago is the best way. That's why He told us that. That's why He created it. And it's just up to us to recognize that all the confusion that the world offers is not equivalent. No better plan for the family than the plan of the Creator. Let me mention another substitute. I think we find in our society, particularly at this time, a substitution of laziness for productivity. I've used this illustration before as well. I think it is true. The difference between now and 100 years ago in America, I think I can say this safely. 100 years ago, if you went to a man and you said, I've got a choice for you. I'll either give you this money or you can work for this money. He would be angry with you. And he would say, you don't think I'll work for it? You think you call me lazy? You think I'm a thief? What do you think I am? He'd be angry. The insult of his character. To think that somehow, well, you don't think I'll work for what I get? If you went today and met the same kind of fellow on the street and offered the same deal, he would be angry for an entirely different reason. He said, well, you think I'm a fool? You think I'll work for that if you just give it to me? What do you think I am? That's a difference between then and now. I've seen these pictures of people during the Depression, and they got government jobs. And they'd be out there digging a ditch, and they would have on some sort of a formal-looking collar and a tie. And somebody would explain that the reason why they were dressed in their best is because they felt like we're working for the government. We feel like we need to show respect for the occasion. I mean, the mindset then and now has changed radically. Go anywhere. Go try to buy a hamburger somewhere. They're closed at 7 o'clock. Why? The hours say to 10. Can't find anybody to work. You know exactly what I'm talking about. And so we've made a radical shift in our thinking. You know, in the Scriptures, it's interesting. And I hope I'm not telling you news here. I believe you know this as well as I do. But it's a mistake to read in Genesis when God created Adam. We remember the curse. Part of the curse was that Adam would eat bread of the sweat of his face. But that's not the whole picture there. The toil and the laborious nature of trying to make the ground yield to him was certainly a part of the curse. But work was not, was it? If you look back in chapter 2 and verse 15, God made the man in order to dress and to keep the garden. And you know why, and I know why. Because we are not made to sit and do nothing. I tell you, if you work a hard job, there are going to be days when you're trying to keep your eyes open driving home and you think, boy, I would like to have a vacation for about 30 years. And maybe I'd like to sleep for about 10 of those 30. And that's the way you feel, and I understand that. But you also know the truth, that it would be like prison if you were just somewhere with nothing to do and no ability to do. We're not made to do that. Men and women are made to be productive. We're made to accomplish things. I think that's one of the reasons why when you read in the Scriptures, and I don't know much more about it than what I'm reading here, but in Revelation chapter 22, nearly the last chapter, we've gone from the first chapter nearly the Bible to near the last chapter. In Revelation 22 and verse 3, he pictures here, well, in verse 1, a heavenly scene, I believe, a street, and 12 manner of fruits on the tree of life. And verse 3 says, there be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. Have you ever heard someone who pictured heaven as sort of sitting on a cloud all day, maybe playing a harp with nothing to do? Let me tell you, that's not the way the Bible portrays heaven. There's a lot that we're not told about the activities of heaven, but I promise you, it's an active place. It's a place of service. Why? Because service is not a curse, it's a blessing. And to be able to serve and to accomplish and to be useful is a great thing. But somehow we've sold a generation or two on the idea that your great purpose in life is to avoid work. People who have never had a job, I'm talking about able-bodied people who've never had a job in their life. Their dad never had a job. Maybe his dad never had a job. The idea of a living is a check that just comes from Magic Town into their mailbox. Not a lot, they get by with it or some other nefarious. This is the way they live. You know, God didn't make you for that kind of sorry existence. There's more to life. There's a happiness and a joy that you are giving up and substituting for what God really would want you to have. And somehow we've got to convince our children of that. I'm not saying that you're not, but I'm saying generally speaking, as a society, we're doing a poor job of that. I have a friend of mine I'm thinking about now. His kids are all grown and they have children. But I remember him telling me one time, he said, you know, I always felt like it was important as a dad, not only to bring my sons to work with me, but to make sure they understood that work was not a curse and not something to be dreaded. But even hard work, you know, there's a great blessing in it. I wanted to give them that sense. And I thought, that's very wise as a parent to do that. It's something that's been lost, I'm afraid, in the minds of many. Let me mention something else right quick. I think another thing, another poor substitution that we see so commonly in our world are religious people, and sometimes our brethren, who substitute what we've come to call the social gospel for the saving gospel. You know, church work today has become really, in the minds of most people, almost exclusively entertainment, secular education, health care, legal rights. Look at the advertisements. Look around and see how, you know, words like social justice, terms like that are used, because that's what the church is for. The church is to get people get their rights and make sure that they get the income and make sure they get this and that. And those things may have their place. But what I find interesting is that when you look at the Great Commission in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in every case the Lord sent out the disciples not to make sure everybody's rights were protected, not to make sure their blood pressure was good, not to make sure that all their kids were proficient in mathematics. That was never the message. Those things have a place, perhaps. But the point is, look in Matthew 28 and verse 18. Jesus told his disciples before he ascended to heaven, he said, all power is given to me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. That's what you need to do. Go and teach them to be Christians. Mark 16's account. Go ye to all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He that believes and is baptized shall be saved. He that believes not shall be damned. Preach the gospel to them. This is not about politics, actually. It's about something that's eternal. In Luke chapter 24, he told them that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. In John 20, Jesus told them that your work is to go forth and to preach the message you've received, the standard you've received. And whoever sins you remit, they'll be remitted, and whoever sins you retain, they'll be retained. Not that they had legislative power, but through them sin would be defined and condemned as well. But that's the message. You can listen sometimes to religious folks and their programs, and you'll never hear the word sin. Never think about judgment. It's all about right now in this life and how to make this life better. Let me tell you, that's a poor substitute for what's real and lasting. Now, there's a place, as I said, for making this life better. That's not my point. And as individual Christians, we're called on to do good to all men, especially those of the household of faith. But the church's work is ultimately spiritual and it's eternal. And I think about that story in Luke chapter 12 and verse 20, where Jesus talked about a man who was a highly successful businessman. He was a great farmer. He had such a return from his investment. He just didn't know where he was going to store it all. But then the message came to him. Thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. And whose shall these things be that thou hast provided? So is he that lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. By and large in our world, churches are places to play and places where you get the physical needs. But what good is that if today we die in sin? There's a place to deal with those issues. But the church is here to make people think about eternity. And if we fail in that, we have failed. And that's all. It's a poor substitute for that which is eternal. Let me mention one more thing quickly. I think in so many cases we find the substitution on the part of people of hypocrisy for holiness. I guess the great example of that is Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. Here were Christians living there and working with the church at Jerusalem. There was an effort made to raise funds for needy saints. And so people were giving of their means to help these folks, and they decided, well, we like the praise, but we don't want to give that much. And so they gave a portion, but they lied about what they gave. If you follow that story, it's just, we love praise, but we don't love integrity that much. And that kind of spirit ultimately led to their both being struck dead. What was the value then of their lives? It doomed them. Hypocrisy always does. Playing a part. That's what hypocrisy is, really. It's something that was rampant among the Jewish religious leaders of Jesus' day. The words of Matthew 23, boy, they are as strong as horseradish, and they are unforgettable. When the Lord talked about the leaders of his day, he did not spare their feelings. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment and mercy and faith. Look how careful I am. Look at what a special servant I am. I'll tithe even the smallest things. Yeah, but you will, as he said, strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. You've left out the thing that's important. Verse 25. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Blind Pharisee, cleanse thou first that which is within the cup and the platter, and the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outwardly, but are inwardly full of dead men's bones and all uncleanness. I don't guess I've ever, since the first time I read this, gone to a cemetery and seen one of those great mausoleums that men erect. Tremendous expense. Well, that's their money. And it is beautiful architecture and beautiful sculpture, but we all know what's inside there. That's what the Lord said. It's just, the Lord's not fooled by outward appearance, by just trying to make people think one thing when really we're not willing to pay the price. We're not willing to be genuine. Paul made the point in reference to serving men. You ought to serve men like you serve God, and you don't serve God with eye service, as he called it. Just the outward appearance. So this is not an accusation, it's just a warning. It's a challenge to the folks sitting right here. I'm sitting in this pew today, and I take the Lord's Supper today, and I sing these good songs today, but where is my heart? Where's my conduct tomorrow or yesterday when I'm not around the brethren? God still sees. It's a poor substitute to offer lip service and eye service to that which is real. How many times, nearly every time that I can remember, that Paul wrote one of these letters that the Holy Spirit preserved, he always would desire for the brethren grace and truth, peace rather. Grace and peace. Over and again, that's what he would write, grace and peace. Those are not just throwaway words, are they? They have a great meaning. Grace, to live in the grace of God, and peace, to have the peace of God. Do we know that to be so? Do we feel that personally? I tell you, Paul did. You know what that looks like, grace and peace? It looks like 2 Timothy, chapter 4 and verse 6. Here's a man, the last letter we have from Paul, I don't know if he wrote another or not, there's not another one preserved for us by the Holy Spirit. Shortly before his death, he knew he was going to die. And so he writes to Timothy to come see him. And he writes these words, and I don't care how many times I've read them, they still are just wash over us with power. I am now ready to be offered, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought a good fight. I have finished my course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give to me at that day, and not to me only, but to all them that love his appearing. That's what the peace is he's talking about. the peace of knowing that you walk in service to God every day, begging His forgiveness, looking for His guidance. I tell you, that cannot be touched compared with the hypocrisy and playing games and God forbid, if we had time, we'd go back to John, 1 John, which makes, I think, the same point. Just how serious am I about what I claim to be my life? And what benefit would I get if I'm not? Let me close with this passage. Again, go back to the words of the Lord over in Matthew chapter 6. In the Sermon on the Mount, so many unforgettable portions of this, but as we divided up chapter 6 and verse 1, take heed, Jesus said, that you do not your alms before men to be seen of them. Otherwise ye have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when you do your alms is the idea of doing some benevolent work, good, giving to others. When you do your alms, do not sound a trumpet before thee, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may have the glory of men. I'll just pause again quickly. I'm not sure. I've heard people maybe go back and forth about this. Did some people literally sound a trumpet? Maybe they did. It's certainly possible. But you don't have to sound a literal trumpet, do you? Let people know. Don't miss this. I'm doing something good here. Why am I doing that? Is it the praise of men that I'm looking for? When you do your alms, don't let the left hand know what the right hand does, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which sees in secret shall reward thee openly. They have their reward. That's one of the most chilling things that I can find written in the New Testament. They have their reward. And it's not much to talk about, is it? We're looking for something greater than bronze shields. We need something more than that poor substitute. Okay, we could talk about some other things, but let's just pause there. I appreciate your kind attention this morning. I hope this simple lesson will be a challenge to all of us. Think about where we are and think about how much God wants to bless us if I will leave my foolish wisdom behind and accept His guidance. If it be your desire this morning to become a Christian, that's really what it's about. It's about laying down self and taking up Christ. No longer I that lives, but Christ lives in me. And I will promise you that will affect everything in your life. It will affect your work, your hobbies, your family, your recreation. It will affect your thinking, your speaking, your going, your doing. If it's worth anything, it'll affect everything. But boy, it is worth it. And the Lord will help us when we fall and fail, and we will. He'll help us and be merciful to us because He loves us so. He just wants to bless us. Let me not be so stubborn as to tell Him no. I will confess Jesus as the Christ. I believe it. And I will turn away from sin, and I will be baptized for remission of sins, raised to walk in newness of life because He said so. And then the work begins. And I'll lean on Him, and He'll hold my hand. And if I have done something to dishonor His name, make that right with Him. If we can pray with you and pray for you, let us know. We give you this opportunity to come to Him. Hope you will. While we stand and sing, will you please come?